She stood on the marble step and felt the chill of the lobby lights through the silk of her dress. Outside, the lake was a black slice. Inside, the Lakefront Grand's chandelier folded the room into a constellation of gold. A quartet tuned somewhere beyond the doors. Men adjusted cuffs. Women laughed in low, practiced cadences. The guest list, the velvet rope, the man at the podium, everything inside the ballroom had been ordered to run like clockwork. Except for the woman at the threshold. The security guard read from a laminated list with the mechanical politeness taught in in-service training. His voice was small under the sheen of the chandeliers. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not on the list." Grace Marlo, Grace Mitchell, legally and in social registers, held the invitation in one gloved hand in the crest of Hartley Enterprises embroidered on her wrist pin. She had spent the afternoon arranging centerpieces, approving table placements, signing the budget memo that made the centerpiece choices possible. She had signed check-ins with Rebecca and the events manager. She had approved the seating of the Mitchell family at table 4. There was a line in the program that read, unmistakably, Hartley Enterprises partner sponsor. Her name was in the program notes as the foundation's benefactor. All of that lived in paper and pixels inside the ballroom. Outside, the guard kept his eyes trained on the list, as if the list itself were a law. Inside, David sipped champagne at a table of his mother's choosing and steered conversations with easy hands. He was the picture of polished charm, his laugh at the right moment, an arm casually draped around Linda Mitchell as she enumerated the names he was supposed to know. He had been practiced at social stages for decades. Tonight, he played host without the burden of ownership. 3 hours earlier, in their bedroom, the scene had been quieter, the lights softer, the stakes disguised as small domestic decisions. "You don't have to go," David had said, half an apology, half a plea, as if he were offering a compromise between love and social survival. He had been more gentle than Grace expected from the man who now raised a decibel for his mother's jokes. "It'll be better if you don't. With Linda there, you know how it looks. They'll stare. They'll ask questions." Grace had sat on the bed, the dress in her lap, the box of grandmother's earrings tucked beside it like a secret talisman. The earrings had been her grandmother's, small, unassuming pearls set in dull gold, worn at church picnics and graduations. Nothing flashy, everything steady. They fit like a memory. They fit like inheritance. "I signed for both of us," Grace had said then, voice even. "The invitation," said the Mitchells. "The program lists Hartley. The guests." "You always make a scene," David cut in. "Not unkindly at first. It's not about you being seen. It's about me being seen. They like things a certain way. You know how they are." She had listened to the phrase where the word "you" slipped out of the sentence and left only what they were both saying without saying. "You are a variable that could disturb the picture I want to present." He wanted a wife who blended, who complemented the portrait but did not complicate the frame. He wanted a version of her that would not dislodge his mother's approval from its pedestal. Grace had sighed, a small, private sound. "Okay," she said. It was not capitulation so much as a maneuver she had become adept at, folding herself small to smooth the edges of other people's discomfort. For years she had done her work under the radar, meetings in back rooms, late-night calls that no one in social circles knew about, charity names that arrived on invitations with her signature buried in pages of legalese. She kept the laces of the companies and the charities neatly bound and out of the way, a cartographer who drew maps but refused to hang them on the parlor wall. She had left the dress there on the bed, put the earrings in the velvet box, and walked to the car. She had told herself she would stay home. She had let herself be small. Now, at the ballroom door, the words, "You're not on the list," pressed against her like a presence. The guard's shoes were polished. The rope felt like a physical line she had walked past 1,000 times and suddenly could not cross. Rebecca's car pulled up just behind her. The engine a polite Rebecca fest, efficient, devotee caught sight of Grace and came around with a small, incredulous laugh that turned into a business-like frown when she took in the guard's stance. "Grace," she said, the name like an emergency bell. "I'm not on the list," the guard said. "Mr. Mitchell called it in." Grace closed her fingers on the invitation. There was a thrum in her ears that wasn't the music. The world narrowed, then expanded. Linda in a jewel-toned dress, the way the headline writers would stab at public drama, the smell of champagne bitter on the tongue now, a reminder that the life she had built wasn't a single event, but an accumulation of decisions that required protection and sometimes, apparently, secrecy. Rebecca stepped forward, the professional armor on. "He shouldn't have done that," she said under her breath. Then she turned to the guard with a calibrated smile. "He's inside. He told you this." "Yep," said he'd handle the Mitchells, the guard said. He glanced at the list again as though it could absolve him. Grace felt the air in her chest reorganize. There was something that had been building for years, a sediment of small omissions and shapeshifts that, when stacked, formed pressure. She could name the moments that had settled into this one. The quiet reticence she'd practiced at dinners. The times she'd let others take bows for work she'd overseen. The way she had diminished herself on purpose to fit into a frame someone else designed. She had done it for David when he asked, and she had done it for Linda when the barbed compliments arrived. Shrinking made social things easier. Shrinking kept the expediencies of love intact, or so she had been told to believe. She stepped back from the rope and watched the ballroom through a seam of glass. The photographer's flash caught a moment of laughter at table 4. David Essa had turned, and for a second his gaze found her at the door with all of its contradicting evidence. The invitation in her gloved hand and the person he had asked to stay home standing there like a challenge. Grace moved in a small, deliberate circle that had the precision of someone who had run meetings for 20 years. Rebecca's hand found hers. "If you want to go in," she said softly, "I'll make it right." Her throat tightened, an old muscle remembering how to go silent. The temptation was immediate, almost physical, to step back from the rope, to decline this bruise of public discomfort, to let the night pass. But the evening had been hers to arrange, and the charity in the program bore the footprint of her name. There was a cruelty in the idea that her husband could tell security she was not invited to her own event, and that the people who counted her contributions could be left in ignorance at the mercy of his version of the truth. She had grown tired of acting as if her existence was a favor bestowed on the room by association with someone else. The years of being adept at making herself smaller had given her an expertise that was now heavy in her hands. She could make herself invisible, and she could make herself seen. This time, she decided she would choose the latter. Rebecca opened her phone and sent a single text to the events manager. 2 minutes later, the manager Avery Hart, careful and exact, emerged from the doors with the look of a person solving a problem and walking into the grind of reputations. He greeted Grace with formal apology in his posture and with a louder voice that cut through the soft chaos of the orchestra. "Ms. Marlo," he said, his face parsing her like a cross-reference, "we've been expecting you." The name landed like a faint explosion. Hartley Enterprises program blurb, the sponsorship plaque by the stage, the embroidered logo on the press desk. These objects conspired to make the truth visible. Avery did not look at David. He looked at her with a professional reverence that entered the room like a cold draft and left David looking suddenly small. Inside the ballroom, the lights shifted to spotlight the head table. Linda, elegant and composed, glanced toward the entrance with a smile that was rehearsed for family theater. In the background, murmur swelled as a guest on the periphery made note of the slight inconsistency between David's earlier coolness and whoever might be arriving with the company's Avery took the microphone with hands that had arranged many events and knew how to stretch a moment into its proper decorum. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, the quartet answering him with a tapering chord. "We are honored to welcome our sponsor for tonight's Hartley Foundation, Gala, Grace Marlo, CEO of Hartley Enterprises." The announcement did not only convey a name, it reframed the room. Applausiosi, polite, and then faster as the pieces clicked into place for those who hadn't known. There was a beat when the room tried to reconcile the Mitchell at table 4 with the Hartley name on the program. There was a smaller, more intimate gasp near the head table. Grace felt the applause as if someone had lit the match under a cool pan. She stepped inside. The music folded away with the sound of the hush that hovered when the host of an evening arrived. On stage, she could see him, David, his smile a fraction too quick now, his hand tightening on a champagne flute. Linda watched with the cool composure of a woman who had always worn the right reactions. The cameras in the room adjusted. In the back, a freelance photographer angled for a shot that already had a headline in its throat. Grace moved with the economy of someone who understood how to make a room listen. Her speech had been written, edited, trusted to feel like gratitude and data in equal measure. The Hartley Foundation's year-end progress, the food programs supported, the scholarships in the city that had been seeded because someone signed off on budgets. She had prepared a line about the neighborhood bakery program that had become a signature metaphor during the campaign. Small business owners who baked in the mornings and taught classes in the afternoons, the charity that gave them refrigeration units and bookkeeping help, the tangible, light work of restoring dignity one oven at a time. The bakery line felt honest because it was true. When you support someone's entire operation, you don't just give them flour, you help them own the whole bakery. She spoke first of the work. The audience gave the necessary, well-trained responses, applause here, a polite laugh there. Her voice was measured. She watched her own hands as if they were instruments of authority, rather than possessions she had once used to smooth someone else's ego. The facts were easy to present. The graduation rate of trainees, the number of meals served, the small business loans facilitated not numbers for spectacle, but markers of labor done in people's lives. And then she shifted, not with anger but with a clarity she had been practicing for months. She had rehearsed this minor pivot with Rebecca, over coffee and then over reheated lunches, testing the balance between vulnerability and ownership. There are moments in public speech when one can ask an audience to do more than listen to statistics. She asked them to witness a small, human truth. I organized this event, she said, gaze swift and steady across the faces that the chandelier had made into constellations. I approved the seating chart. The program you hold bore my signature, the phrase uncoiled like a footnote becoming its own paragraph. Someone in the back whispered, and the sound spread. Grace let the room breathe with the new information. There were eyes that slid to David as if expecting some corrective flourish from the man who had earlier said it would be easier if she did not attend. She continued, softer now, as if speaking to the seat of the chair she had occupied for years. There are good people who do hard things in quieter rooms. There are staff who work through Saturdays. There are women who have saved and invested and built books of business and were told to be a certain way in order to be presentable to the social scene. I wanted tonight to be about them. There was applause, some of it sincere, some of it the show of good breeding. Then she put down the script. The laundry list was over. This was the moment she had chosen to fold private grievance into public reckoning. Not to shame, but to clarify. Last night, she said, and the hush thickened, my husband told security I wasn't invited. It landed like a stone thrown into still water. Conversation halted mid-stitch. David's lips parted, his hand jerked as if to catch the momentum of the night and hold it from spilling. Linda's expression betrayed nothing, yet but in her eyes was the calculation of an elegant woman who knew how to make a minor scandal mirror reality into order. Grace's voice did not shake. He told them I wasn't on the list. A ripple this time of disbelief. Cameras found the action. Someone with a phone angled for a live clip. Social feeds are hungry and fast. The moment was already finding its habitat. She watched David in the same way she had watched him on the threshold. The quick charm, the practiced defensiveness, the attempt to keep the edge of the story smoothed over by a joke or a denial. He stood and crossed toward the stage, mouth opening with something like an excuse. Grace, she did not step back. No, she said, with the calm of a sentence that had been written over months and finally printed. There is a difference between shutting someone down and setting a boundary. Her refusal was a boundary that belonged to her. I hid parts of my life for many reasons, she told the room. The sentence abridged personal, yet public, sometimes to protect a marriage, sometimes to avoid a family conversation that might go poorly, sometimes because, once, I believed I had to disappear to keep someone's peace. She watched faces as the room assembled its understanding. A woman who had managed the Hartley name in the economy of corporate philanthropy had also, privately, made herself small to keep domestic peace. That admission was not an excuse, but a map. You loved what I let you believe about myself. she said, and the sentence was a shard of the truth. It was sharp and precise in a way that required accountability. The phrase landed with the specificity of a confession that doubles as an indictment. She had rehearsed it not to hurt but to make visible the terms of the bargain he had been making with himself and with their life together. A version of her that fit his comfort. David's face collapsed inward for an instant. He had always been good at public narratives, good at pivot lines that smoothed a room's friction. Now, without the ability to redraw the frame, he found himself exposed to the people he had wanted to impress. He started to speak again, arranging a public apology. An embarrassed laugh to absorb the awkwardness. He moved as if he could intercept the sentence in the air. Grace said what she had decided she would say. "I'm done making myself small." The words were simple. They were not theatrical. They were a shift in posture. A silence followed a tangible thing. Applause somewhere at the edge of the room felt like the world rearranging itself to catch up to her. David's attempt to insert himself, to step between her and her truth, was foiled by the room and by the steadiness of the microphone. He gestured. She did not budge. Rebecca's expression in the wings was a mixture of fierce pride and something like relief. Photographs were taken. The clip of Grace stepping onto the stage, lights finding her as applause rose, and then a hush for the announcement, landed online before the quartet finished their last chord. News trended in small pockets. An influencer in a red dress posted a short, incredulous video. A political commentator posted a snarky take. The Hartley Foundation's PR team began damage control keystrokes even as Grace's staff clicked through the images. The economy of the internet would make its own verdicts, often shallow and always swift. David found his voice at last. He tried to soften his movements, to place his hand on her arm in public in a conciliatory gesture. "Grace, that was," he began. But the room interpreted the movement in different ways. Some read it as supplication. Some read it as an attempt at control. Linda's expression hardened into a faint crease of disapproval, as if the scene were a domestic failure staged for her discomfort. Grace felt all these looks like small weights, but she carried them without the old tremor. She had chosen to bring the night into the light. She finished her remarks on the foundation, redirecting to the beneficiaries, to the work that mattered beyond the rupture. Her voice anchored on the people who would not see their forms of recovery turned into gossip. The applause that followed was messy and real. When the microphone was handed back and the room returned to its many hums, people came up to congratulate her, some sincere, some curious. The Mitchells retreated to table 4 with a kind of domestic recalibration taking place. Linda's mouth pressed thin. Ryan, David's brother, offered a quick smile from across the table and then looked away. David stayed for a moment, as if weighing the option of following her to the green room where she would excuse herself or staying put to perform the act of family that looked as though nothing had shifted. Instead, he excused himself to step outside, and there was a brief scene. 2 figures under the awning, the world of the gala aglow behind glass. He spoke low. Grace listened. She did not take his hand when he offered it. He tried to reach across the thin public distance to explain, to soften the moment into something that could be lived with, but her not taking of his hand was a small act that carried the lineage of years of rehearsed self. She had chosen, in the thin moments outside the door, to step back into herself. "You did this," he said. The accusation, a gentle throw, because he could not believe, perhaps, that she would call out his action in public. It cut him where his social reputation lived the part he took great pains to curate. "I did what I had to do," she told him. "I told the truth. I stood in a room I paid for. I walked to a stage that had my name on the program. I won't ask permission to be visible." He tried words of apology that tasted of late realizations. She heard them as words. The next morning, his voice would arrive in long messages: apology, explanation, regret, but at this moment, the live air between them was a decision point. She had no illusions about what would come. The heartbreak, the public parsing, the private paperwork. She wanted, mainly, to own the shape of what came next. The night spilled outward. Clips multiplied online. Someone at a neighborhood site captured a clip of the exchange and captioned it with a sharp line that made its way into feeds. "He wouldn't let his wife in. She's the host." The Hartley Foundation's PR account posted a short statement praising the evening's outcomes and thanking the sponsors. Grace's office account shared photographs of the gala's beneficiaries with captions that redirected attention back to mission. The media arrived the next morning with polite inquiries. One reporter from the Tribune requested a conversation, and the family exchanged texts that vibrated into small pockets of offended and sympathetic replies. At home that night, Grace opened the velvet box she had left on the bed. The grandmother's earrings, cool against her palm. Her grandmother's handwriting lived in a note beneath the satin, a line that had been folded away and kept for moments of indecision. Do not ever let them trim your light to make their shadows look grand. She had learned to interpret the note as part admonition, part benediction. She pressed the earrings to her lobes and saw herself in the mirror with a new steadiness. The act was private and aimed at anointing oneself with lineage. In the hours that followed, she read the messages that streamed into her phone. David left voice messages that alternated between apology and pleading. Linda's calls went unanswered. Ryan sent a short text asking if she was all right, and then a picture of a family heirloom he thought might smooth things over. Rebecca stayed up to assemble a list of interviewers, a short media protocol, and a plan to address the more damaging rumors that might flourish. The next morning, the office looked like a monocle of calm. Hartley Enterprises' glass windows caught the city. There was a meeting scheduled at noon with the board to discuss the night's optics. There were delivery reports and program revenue tallies. Grace sat at her desk, the velvet box open beside her. She listened to the hum that her life had become. Emails pinging, the PR team's recommendations, the board's cautious phrasing about family matters. The Tribune reporter arrived with a notebook and a quiet curiosity. "Do you want to talk about last night?" she asked, and the question was less for content than for a kind of verification. A public person asked whether she would be public about her private life. Grace agreed to an interview on the condition that the conversation stay about the work first. She wanted the stories of bread ovens and scholarship recipients to outrun the gossip of an argument at the threshold. The reporter, professional and precise, listened while Grace outlined the charity's goals and the next phases of the bakery program. When the conversation turned toward the viral clip, the reporter asked the question they all wanted to know: what would she do next? Grace rested her fingers on the velvet box. "I will continue our work," she said. "I will continue to be visible for the people who depend on it. I will not shrink anymore to make others comfortable." The article ran with a headline that tried to find a balance. Hartley CEO's Gala draws press on family fallout. It quoted the bakery's successes and included Grace's line about not shrinking. The clip of the stage moment had already churned into 100 variations. Some commenters were sympathetic. Others argued that she had made a spectacle. The room that had formerly been private now had comment threads. David's calls multiplied into longer, more tangled messages. One voicemail, left at 3:12 a.m., wavered between apology and accusation. He felt misunderstood. He had been trying to protect her from family scrutiny. He had not anticipated that the story would turn. Grace listened and let it sit in the groove of the phone. She did not return the call. The legal conversations arrived with the quiet prickle of administrative closure. Grace had always kept her personal and corporate counsel separate. Lawyers were forward when boundaries moved from sentences to statutes. Rebecca sat with her in a conference room as a lawyer from the firm they had used for corporate matters carefully outlined options. "If you want to ensure the company's interests are protected and your personal interests are clear, we should talk about separation," he said in legalese. Made gentle by habit, she had imagined different endings to nights like this in the privacy of nocturnal reverie, dramatic reconciliations, long, soulful conversations that ended in greater mutual understanding. But the sequence of how they had treated her, the instruction to security, the way he had been willing to erase her presence for the sake of appearances, wore on her like the slow abrasion of an old piece of clothing. She had done the work of hiding. Now she had to do the work of uncovering. She asked questions about public statements, about confidentiality, about a timeline that would not feel rushed but would not linger in permanent indecision. Rebecca brought tea and a quiet, steadying presence. The conversation turned to practicalities, the divvying of belongings, the terms of the separation in legal language that translated complex emotions into check. Grace insisted that the settlement be fair and that the Hartley assets be clarified publicly as hers where necessary. The company she had brought into the rooms where other people wanted to pretend they had been the primary benefactor. The lawyer made notes and promised discretion. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized in the way grown-up separations are done. Hearings and signatures, statements, and the slow, precise unweaving of joint accounts. The settlement was fair, as the lawyer had insisted, and the public statement written and precise focused on mutual respect and continued prioritization of the foundation's work. The parties agreed to a non-sensational move forward, and the courthouses closed the chapter with the prosaic weight of legal validation. After the court's clerk stamped the last sheet, Grace sat in her office with Rebecca across from her, and the velvet box open between them. "You did not have to fight for any of that," Rebecca said, but her voice held no reproach. "You only had to choose it." Grace touched the pearls, feeling the small warm press of them in her hand. She thought of her grandmother's note and the way the line creased at that instruction, "Do not trim your light." She had been taught, in the family kitchen of her childhood, to value hard work and quiet achievements. She had also been taught to prioritize peace over recognition. The realization that some peace asks you to fold yourself into a shape you cannot maintain was a new kind of grief. She had, in the months that followed, learned that reclaiming a life is an accumulation of small triumphs, not a single grand gesture. She went back to work with a focus that was hallowed and yet full, like a bowl carved out to hold something substantial. Meetings resumed, new hires were onboarded, the bakery program expanded. The press cycles that had been hungry for scandal found better preoccupations and let the story settle into human terms. A CEO who had been the architect of a foundation and whose private life had become a brief public, not before dissolving into the everyday labor of the organization. There were awkward run-ins in event where David stood across the room and clapped politely. A holiday where Linda sent a card with a cramped, formal hand, but the main work of the life she kept was steady. She made executive decisions about operations and attended a board meeting where she spoke plainly about what it meant to fund dignity work. She made public appearances less frequently than before, but with a specific aim to highlight beneficiaries, to push accountability to grantees, and to keep the Hartley name tethered to the people it was meant to serve. On a rainy afternoon, months after the settlement, she sat at her window and listened to the city. The morning horizon pulled itself into a thin line of light. She opened up the velvet box and took out the grandmother's earrings. She thought about the small lineage of women who had taught her to measure life in deeds and the ways she would now instruct her staff to be unafraid of the public eye, not because the public applauded, but because sometimes visibility is the only vector of change. Rebecca knocked and entered with 2 mugs of coffee and the board's latest strategy document. But the pause before conversation stretched into a quiet kind of contentment. "They don't know what it takes," Rebecca said, referring to those who had debated the viral clip. "But you do." "I own the whole bakery now," Grace said, an old metaphor she had used at planning meetings and in strategy sessions. She meant it as more than a line in a presentation. She meant it literally in the sense that she would not allow the parts of her life that produced value to be disavowed in social rooms that wanted to keep her small. Owning the bakery was to claim the ovens, the ledgers, the people who taught classes at night, everything that made the business more than a picture on a donation letter. "You're going back," Rebecca said after a moment, reading Grace's face as if it were a map. "The gala next year. You should lead it, not for revenge, for clarity." Grace allowed herself the small pleasure of the thought. Returning to the ballroom without a partner at her side and with her name publicly and plainly affixed to the work. It felt like a crest she could ride. She would own the room, not as someone who allowed herself to be framed by others, but as someone who had always stepped behind scenes and built programs the public now applauded. The following year's gala arrived like an anniversary of a healed wound. The Lakefront Grand glittered as if no time had passed. The quartet played a softer tune. Press, photographers milled. Guests arrived in droves with the correct kinds of smiles and managed to appear both surprised and delighted that the event had matured into a major community fixture. This time, the check-in line had her photo on the program cover, a portrait taken months before. Professional and calm. A woman who had learned to bend truth into purpose rather than performance. She entered alone. The security guard at the door, different from the man who had once read a list like scripture, halted for a breath in respect and offered a brief nod. He had been instructed, likely by Rebecca and the events team, that the CEO walked in unimpeded. His hand touched the rope with the professional deference of someone who had been told where lines should stand. The room recognized her in a way that was not about gossip. It was the recognition of someone whose work had continued despite the clatter of a year's distractions. People who had donated to the bakery program found her and said thank you, with faces that had learned the difference between a curated persona and persistent substance. The Mitchells were present too, David, with a measured smile. Linda, with the careful posture of someone practicing civility, but they no longer stood at the center of the narrative. The spotlight found Grace by design rather than by accident. She moved through the room with a steady pace, not needing to be introduced, not needing to shrink at a joke or to attune her posture to someone else's idea of propriety. The velvet box rested in her clutch, a talisman in case the old habit of compromise felt tempting. She ran her fingers around the satin and felt the familiar cool of the pearls. No one asked to see them, but they were present in her memory like a line of instruction. At the podium, she addressed the room about the year's progress in a speech that folded movement and number into human stories. She spoke of the baker who had opened a second store, of students who had graduated from a vocational program, of the teenage mother who had been given a scholarship to return to school. Her voice carried calm conviction. When she finished, the applause was not merely polite. It was how. Outside, a security guard who had stood in her way the year before approached with a quiet, small apology. He did not need to. The gesture was minimal and sincere. She accepted it because she knew how the world made amends in its own way. A nod, a correction, an alignment of professional lines. The room leaned back into its social economy. At the close of the evening, Rebecca walked up to her with a grin. "You were yourself all night," she said. Grace thought of the quiet things that had led to this, the filing of papers, the small conversations guided by morality and legal counsel, the steadfast refusal to let her worth be negotiated in private. She thought of her grandmother's handwriting in the velvet box, and of how many women had shaped her understanding of dignity. She thought of the way the city had turned from gossip to gratitude. She had learned the cost of being visible. She had also learned the liberation of refusing to let others buy her silence. "We'll keep baking," she said. The words were literal and figurative, a promise to the people who had come to depend on the ovens and the classes, and to herself. As the lights dimmed and the last of the guests drifted into the night, she lingered at the edge of the ballroom and looked back at the stage. The chandeliers caught the memory of the previous year and made it small against the new arrangement of things. No dramatic reconciliation had been stitched back into their life. That was not the story she had been interested in telling. She had wanted to step forward into ownership of the foundation, of her name, of the life she had built in, to stop apologizing for occupying space. She turned and walked out into the night with the quiet company of the people who believed in work over image. The city smelled of late rain and something like possibility. Her phone buzzed with messages, some small, some exultant, but the feeling that settled around her was not about applause. It was the sense of a self that had been tended to for once, affirmed not just in private but in the public rooms where power is often assigned and reclaimed. If you've ever felt you had to make yourself smaller to keep others comfortable, leave a comment, share the moment when you chose otherwise. And if this story spoke to you, subscribe to hear more about people who choose to own what is theirs.